time now to introduce the first speaker, who is Gary Hart, who is a former United States Senator and former presidential candidate. He now writes and lectures on foreign policy and international security. He was co-chair of the United States Commission on National Security for the 21st century, which forecast terrorist attacks on the United States. And he's written 13 books, of which the latest, which was published last week, I believe, is The Fourth Power, a new grand strategy for the US in the 21st century. Gary Hart.
Thank you very much. This assigned topic this evening reminded me very much of an impoverished school teacher in America during the Great Depression who not only couldn't find a teaching job, he couldn't find any job, and he heard about a possible teaching assignment in a small parish in Louisiana. So he cabled ahead saying, "Hold the job, I'm on my way." And he got there after a long train trip. And the school board invited him to come interview. And the chairman of the school board said, "There are 6 of us, and there's only one thing we care about. 3 of us think the world is round, and 3 of us think the world is flat. What is your position?" He said, "I can teach it round or I can teach it flat." Despite the fact that the topic this evening is phrased very much in theoretical terms, I think it's clear to all of us that we are here to discuss America's invasion of Iraq. In order to do that, however, I'd like to suggest some stipulations based upon the proposition we've been given. The first is that there is evil, including brutal dictators in the world. Terrorism, especially attacks on civilians, is a manifestation of that evil. Preemption has always been a defensive option for individuals and for nations. Preemption is justified when a threat is immediate and unavoidable. A nation under threat does not require international authorization to protect itself. Finally, Iraq did not represent a threat requiring preemption. The commission which I co-chaired, the U.S. Commission on National Security for the 21st Century, identified as early as September of 1999 the terrorist threat to America, and according to our mandate reported to the next President of the United States, the new President George W. Bush, recommending that a National Homeland Security Agency be created to protect our country from those threats. We said in that report, quote, "In cases of clear and imminent danger, the United States military must be able to take preemptive action overseas in circumstances where local authorities are unable or unwilling to act." So I come back to the phrase immediate and unavoidable. Those are the grounds by which in ancient English common law, individuals have been able to protect themselves, their families, and their property from intrusion or assault by an invader. But to prevent someone from settling scores with an unpleasant neighbor who it was rumored may have acquired a gun or a knife, and the frightened neighbor going over and preemptively shooting the person he fears, the threat always has had to be, both for individuals in their households and ultimately under international law for nations, that the threat be immediate and unavoidable. That threat was not present in Iraq. And preemption as such is not the foundation, nor can it be, of an entire foreign policy for the United States or anyone else. Otherwise, the State Department, followed by or in conjunction with the Defense Department, would do nothing but survey the world, looking for nations that might tomorrow, next year, or 20 years from now represent a threat to us, and therefore we will preemptively invade them. What in fact was going on in Iraq I think it's pretty clear, is that this administration, Bush administration, undertook a preventive war of regime change and state restructuring. Why this is of danger to my country particularly is that we salute the flag of the United States of America and the republic for which it stands. To my knowledge, there has never in human history been a republic that was also an empire. Witness 1st century BC Rome. The qualities of empire are distinctly different from the qualities of a republic, and that is why republics cannot, by definition, become imperial. What was undertaken by my current government in America in 2003 was an imperial act. One can debate whether or not America is or should be an empire, and indeed there is, as I think many of you know, an eminent British historian, Neil Ferguson, now teaching in the United States, who argues not only that America should be an empire, but that it is in fact de facto an empire, and ought to get on with it. He is joined, by the way, with a number of other authors now preaching America as empire in the 21st century. If, however, America becomes an empire, two things have to happen. One is our leadership must tell us that's what's going on, and two, we must acknowledge that it no longer makes sense to salute the flag of a republic. My quarrel with the Bush administration is not just the invasion of Iraq, it is that the reasons for the invasion were not clearly, distinctly, and honestly laid before the American people. Senior policymakers of this administration, as I think all of you know, have been after Saddam Hussein since 1991, and they've been very outspoken about it, that is, up to and until the opportunity arose, post 9/11, to actually carry out the plan. Then it became weapons of mass destruction, then it became ties with terrorism, then it became the next step after Afghanistan in the war on terrorism. But in fact, the policy, laid 10 or more years before, was to get rid of Saddam Hussein, conduct regime change, restructure the government of Iraq, use that country as a prime military base for U.S. forces and a diplomatic base as well, to transform the Middle East. By the way, we can protect world oil supplies and carry out a number of very beneficial activities. That is a plausible policy. The problem was the administration was not honest with the American people in laying that policy before us. Part of the reason was they thought the war would be over early, and they were right about that, but they didn't plan for a lengthy reconstruction and a messy security situation. And that is why the grand scheme of acting, if you will, preemptively in the name of the war on terrorism, but in fact to carry out an imperial occupation of the most difficult region of the world to try to transform it without telling the American people what we were up to, was a prescription for folly. So in brief, preemption cannot be the basis for a foreign policy for the United States or anyone else. It is a doctrine under which any nation or any individual can defend itself or himself or herself if an attack is imminent and unavoidable. Such was not the case in Iraq.
Thank you to Gary Hart. And now I invite to speak against the motion Christopher Hitchens, who's a writer, broadcaster, and columnist. He emigrated to the United States in 1981. For the past 12 years, he's been columnist and contributing editor at Vanity Fair, and has reported, I believe, from something like 60 countries on 5 different continents. His books include studies of the Kurds, the UN, the Palestine question, Clinton, Kissinger, and his most recent is A Long Short War, the Postponed Liberation of Iraq. Ladies and gentlemen, Christopher Hitchens.
Thank you, ma'am. Ladies and gentlemen, Can I go as far as brothers and sisters? Good. Comrades and friends? Okay. I apologize for speaking to you through a wad of inflammation from my recent adventures in American dentistry. I don't want to sound more than usually as if I have a plum lodged in my mouth, but I don't want you to mistake my vulnerability for weakness. Many of you will know how terrible it can be to be savaged by a hamster. I also want to say what a distinction it is to appear not just with Comrade Aaronovitch, with whose father I was at Balliol College when Sam Aaronovitch, a very celebrated old fighter, was a mature student there, but with Simon Jenkins, who's been lending tone to my profession since I was the merest cub in it, and with Senator Hart, who I remember very well from my earliest days in Washington. He has, among other things, he's too modest to say it, the distinction of having got Senator Patrick Moynihan of New York to vote for the one and only time that he ever did against a defense appropriation, namely the MX missile. It was, I think I'm correct in saying, on the motion of Senator Hart that this missile was condemned on the grounds that, since it was designed to destroy already hardened and cemented and buried missile bunkers, it presumably would not be launched when those bunkers were already empty. That would be, as it were, a waste of energy. Preemptive it might have been, but aggressive would also cover it. It was a very dangerous and destabilizing weapon, and I remember that debate and the honorable contribution made by the Senator very vividly. And I remember the way, indeed, in which that the idea, originally very intensely American, well, you get your retaliation in first, helped to degenerate the idea of deterrence and degenerate it further into effectively a policy of use them or lose them. And this was the point at which we had degenerated when the Cold War fortunately ended and a certain amount of sanity supervened, but we're in the debt of those who kept their heads before that sanity kicked in. Now, I mentioned therefore that obviously for a reason. And I'm not the only person to have read the Senator's study of threats to Homeland Security with a wince at the warnings that were overlooked and ignored. But what if I put the case, as Mr. Jaggers used to say, what if I put the case? What if the warnings hadn't been overlooked and ignored? In early 2001 in Afghanistan, the following occurred. The ancient statues of Bamiyan, the two twin, not quite twin, but matching Buddhas, testimony to the time of the Hellenic influence, even of Alexander himself, and the fusion of Buddhism in the ancient civilizations of Afghanistan, were destroyed by heavy artillery by the Taliban as the result of an argument within their own ranks, which we know was carried in the direction of vandalism and cultural obliteration by the influence of the Al-Qaeda guests who they were sheltering. It was a warning, I'll put this briefly. That was a warning, ladies and gentlemen. Those weren't the only two twin structure objects they had in mind, but you could tell a lot from what they were doing there. And they gave ample warning of their intention to desecrate and destroy Afghan civilization and culture. And I think there was more of a warning than that in it. At the time, the Taliban was not recognized as the government of Afghanistan, except by Saudi Arabia and Pakistan and the United Arab Emirates, I'm sad to say for them. It was not recognized as the legitimate government. It wasn't recognized by the UN. It wasn't in control of the country. It hadn't demonstrated sovereignty, let alone legitimacy. UNESCO had for a long time declared that property to be common property, the common property of humanity, the common cultural holding of our luckless species. What would have been wrong with dropping in a small force to say, on the day that dawned, whether these structures were to be shelled, obliterated, destroyed, no, you don't. We're standing between you and them. You don't have the right to do this. And by the way, we know what you're up to. I submit that that would have been an admirable thing in every respect. It would have incrementally, at least, but I think in the sense of principle as well, beefed up the fragile sense, the one that we're all so aware of not having now, of an international community that knows what it's talking about and doesn't, in the old phrase, stand idly by. I'll give this example just to let it settle in. It's often assumed, I think, that the concept of preemption, even prevention, runs counter, is promiscuous, unilateralist, runs counter to the nexus of international law and of institutions, indeed, that have been so painstakingly knit together since 1945, since the Declaration of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and its its inscription in the Charter of the United Nations. Actually, that's not as true as many people think. The Genocide Convention, for example, to which this government is a signatory, as is the government of the United States, and many others, mandates signatory powers, upon receiving information that an attempt to exterminate in whole or in part a national or ethnic group is underway, mandates, and I repeat, to take action, either to prevent or, depending on how bad things have been allowed to get, to punish or to try and undo such a process. You have every right as a state not to sign the Genocide Convention. Having signed it, however, you are committed to taking action which unfortunately will be determined for you by genocideurs, by people who want to commit genocide, and you'd better be ready. And you'd better be ready actually to preempt them. I won't waste your time by pointing out also that the UN Charter contains automatic, axiomatic clauses about self-defense, which allow all nations to judge this to be in their own interests, but as the senators pointed out, this is something nations are as likely to take advantage of as otherwise. There are also such things as treaties and agreements and instruments. Since I'm speaking in London, I'll mention a couple that are especially relevant here. We had an undertaking, comrades, ladies and gentlemen, with the people of what was then Southern Rhodesia. The undertaking took the following form. We will not grant independence to this colony until there's been a majority rule election. It was an undertaking we made to them. We gave them our word, to use an old-fashioned phrase. It was also an undertaking we made to the Decolonization Committee of the United Nations. It was an undertaking further made to Parliament. I'm talking about the period 1963 onwards. In 1965, when it became evident that the reserve strength of reaction in Southern Rhodesia was great enough to license the probability of a military coup, a mutiny in the armed forces of the Crown, a declaration unilaterally of independence, all the things, in fact, that did lead to 20 years of war and waste and shame, the Labour government of Harold Wilson announced in advance that it would not use force to prevent this happening. The option of preemption was thrown away. This was as much as to say, to issue an invitation to those about to announce their own coup and their own aggression. And we're paying for it to this day, as are the people of what is now Zimbabwe. We had a treaty we insisted upon ourselves with the people of Cyprus, written in 1960, guaranteeing a British force in defense of constitutional law and order in Cyprus and to avoid either partition, Taksim as the Turks call it, or enosis as the Greeks call it, unification with Greece. In 1974 it became very evident that a military operation was in the making, directed from Athens to destroy the elected sovereign government of Archbishop Makarios, with whom we have this treaty. It was not found convenient to honor the terms of the treaty. Elaborate excuses were found for saying why this would not be appropriate. The net was spread in the eyes of the bird, however. Everyone could see it coming, and those who let it run have to accept the responsibility for what they did and did not do to preempt what very nearly became a 3- and 4-country war in the Mediterranean and on the southern flank of NATO. Read, if you can, without weeping, the account given by General Romeo Dallaire, a Quebecois officer of some gallantry and experience who had the franchise, I don't mean the franchise at all, I mean the commission to represent the United Nations in Rwanda, in Kigali, in 1991. He received clear intelligence of not just the intention of the genocide, but of the times, places, dates, and hours on which instructions for it and orders for it would be transmitted over the government radio, the meeting points of the militia who would carry it out, and many other horrifying signs that what was long feared was now in train. We have the cables he sent to Kofi Annan's desk. Kofi Annan's been forced to admit he got the faxes and the cables, saying, all we need to do is double our admittedly fairly small force. We have 200 people, I think, in Kigali then. Let's make it 500, and let's make a démarche to the Rwandan authorities. We're beefing up our forces, we're not telling you by how much, and we know what you're doing. What is our condemnation here? What does everyone in this hall have to feel bad about when they read this? Not that we failed in Rwanda, but we did not try. It was not found convenient to attempt a preemption of what we knew was coming, nor a prevention, nor even a prophylaxis, ladies and gentlemen, comrades, not even a prophylaxis of this mass murder. Now, I had no idea we were going to be discussing Iraq this evening until the senator brought it up. But I don't mind fighting on my feet and responding, spontaneously. The motion is about preemption as far as I can see, and I hope I've given you some food for thought on it. But if we must discuss Iraq, then I think we have to say this, so we mustn't discuss it without bearing this in mind. There are 4 conditions under which a state, a sovereign state, can lose or surrender its sovereignty and become, as it were, either the common responsibility of, or in some cases, the common protectorate of the international community or those who act for it. In the case that it invades or tries to occupy a neighbor, in the case that it violates the Genocide Convention that I've mentioned, in the case that it fools around with, I'll put it no higher, the Non-Proliferation Treaty governing weapons of mass destruction, that it is thought to be concealing or otherwise fabricating evidence about weapons of mass destruction, and if it is a harborer of international terrorism. The government of Iraq under Saddam Hussein met all these 4 conditions amply, or had done so. It had not just invaded Kuwait, it had abolished the existence of a neighboring Arab Muslim country. It said this is now part of Iraq. It had, as everyone knows, invaded Iran and proposed to do so again. It was for that reason, largely, that it had developed and refused to declare any more its stocks of, or make an honest accounting of its stocks of, horrific weapons of mass destruction. It was, I went to see him there myself, the home base of Abu Nidal, before the emergence of Osama bin Laden, the most wanted man in the world, who was not hiding in Baghdad under government protection, but was an arm of the Ba'ath Party with a villa, a phone number, and a car. It was easy to find him. It wasn't any great journalistic enterprise on my part. And was a regime that was pumping out extraordinary propaganda of jihadism, very rank anti-Semitic propaganda, preachments of violence and terrorism on a daily, hourly, in fact, basis. Let's not say, if you don't want to talk the language of scaring people or fright or moral blackmail, let's not say an imminent threat if you don't want to, if that triggers some horrific response. But anyone who said it wasn't a permanent threat would be fooling themselves. And anyone who thought that it would remain stable would be fooling themselves too. And if you don't preempt yourself, someone is going to preempt you. Iraq wasn't going to remain just like this, bad as it was. It was soon going to become the property of the Uday Qusay regime. That would have been a great deal of fun to watch from everything I know about those 2 brothers. It could have been an Uday versus Qusay regime as well, before that gave way in turn to a Hobbesian state, a failed state and a rogue state, of all against all, right along the sea lanes of the Gulf, and leading eventually to a triumph of the crudest form of jihadist force. That's what not doing anything about Iraq was inviting. I think that's the case that many of us made for regime change in Iraq, have been making for many years, is not made any worse by George Bush suddenly deciding he agrees with us. I welcome him to our councils. I wouldn't have put it, as a senator wouldn't either, quite the way he did, but it's better than pretending that Iraq is no problem at all. And I'm beginning to get very tired of those who act as if you can either go and make a mess in Iraq, or you can leave it alone and everything there will presumably, by that standard, be tranquil. Let me say if I'm trespassing on my time. I obviously have a better idea than I thought I did of when I'm de trop. In this category of inescapable, unavoidable confrontations, I don't have time to dilate any further, but it seems to me they would include the Japanese Empire in the Pacific in the 1930s, the attempt to create a greater Serbia out of the ruins of old Yugoslavia, and Iraq, that one has to know and be aware and have enough sense of history, as well as of the present, as well as of international law and custom and practice, to know that when a confrontation is coming, that if you say that you'll take the burden on yourself, so to speak, you're accepting responsibility. You're not becoming the aggressor. The corollary will have to be, if you accept the inevitability of confrontation with aggressive totalitarian regimes, that the time and place of the confrontation will be left to them, and will be left by us to them on purpose. I don't believe there's a single person in this room who really assents to that proposition. So I'll close by saying that a foreign policy must not be merely preemptive, but a foreign policy that doesn't have a preemptive sensibility and capacity is not just going to lead to disaster, but also to defeat. And not only that, but also to disgrace and ultimately to shame. And I invite your opposition to this well-meaning but ill-drafted proposition, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Christopher. Well, the second speaker for the motion is Simon Jenkins, who, as I'm sure you know, is eminent columnist, former editor of both The Times and the London Evening Standard, and indeed sometime political editor also of The Economist. He was aside from his recent role as indeed the ultimate arbiter of Britain's 1,000 best houses and churches, he's also been the chair of the Independent Commission on Local Democracy and has also sat on the Millennium Commission and indeed many others. Simon.
Well, thank you very much, Francine. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Another amazing turnout at Intelligence Squared. I'd like to thank, particularly on our behalf, two visitors from America, showing that distance in no way diminishes our shared concerns for foreign policy at the moment. And I'm delighted to be sharing a platform once again with David Aaronovitch. I've pleaded with the organisers to let me debate against him, but not from the left always. But that goes to show the infinite mutability of human affairs and of the Guardian newspaper. However, I'm delighted to be on this side of the House tonight, and even against David. The one other thing I wanted to say by way of preamble was I too, in a sense, wanted to keep off Iraq, if only because we've discussed it so often, and I think we all know where we are on it. And I was rather hoping that we would move to, in a sense, generalize some of the points that arise from this particular, as I see it, debacle, such that we can apply them to other similar occasions, similar events, which might concern us. I myself am not against military intervention. I was in favor of the Falklands War. I thought that was a just war. I was in favor of the first Gulf War. I thought that was a just war. It was repelling an act of aggression. I also have to say I don't think I'm against the concept of preemptive targeted action against the modern form that terrorism has now taken, in such a way that when you know someone is somewhere else and is going to attack you at a specific time in a particular place, I think nowadays most people do regard you as justified. If you cannot get the harbourer of the terrorist, you're justified in going in some sense, taking them out. I remember vividly when the Israelis took out the Iraq nuclear power station in 1981, I think it was. I thought that seemed to be a justifiable, specific, targeted action. I have to say it was not the view taken by either the British or the American governments, which protested it strongly. It just shows what happens when Saddam Hussein is good rather than Saddam Hussein is bad. But these were situations in which the concept of preemption, which is the basis of the debate this evening, did have some relevance. However, there are two central worries that I have over the doctrine of preemption as adumbrated by George Bush in advance of the Iraq invasion and then as practiced in that invasion. The first has been referred to by Gary Hart. It is that there is a very good reason why the doctrine of preemption is expressed in international law in very specific terms. Those terms are that the threat against which you are launching your attack is unavoidable and immediate. That was, it has to be said, the view taken by spokesmen for the British government, including the leader of the British government. And to that extent, if we accept the bona fides with which that was done, as 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 inquiries so far have done, then Iraq is not, in fact, an example against our case. But we now know better. But as far as the general principle is concerned, that a threat should be unavoidable and immediate is written into the laws of international relations for the excellent reason that if it's not, anything goes. You cannot have a state of affairs in which any reasonably powerful country that thinks it's going to win a war feels utterly justified in going ahead with the war because it's managed to invent some sort of threat. And I think that this license to bully, as it's called, is, unfortunately, the basis on which almost all preemptive wars tend to be declared. When the Russians invaded Hungary in 1956, they did so because they claimed that the revolution in Hungary constituted a threat to the Soviet Union. When Britain went to war in Suez against Egypt, it was because the nationalization of the canal constituted a threat, which we had to preempt in some way. When the Americans invaded Grenada, it was because they'd found a threat from Grenada to some neighboring country. It is not beyond the wit of any secret service around the world to cobble together a threat to justify that sort of war. And the reason why there has been so much attention devoted to the question of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq is that there was a very good reason why there should have been weapons of mass destruction with, so to speak, 45-minute launch times. That was the basis on which you could justify this sort of war. And if you couldn't find those weapons, the war failed on that account. Yes, you could fall back on regime change and the awfulness of Saddam and so on, but in international law you needed that. Tony Blair knew it, and he still knows it, and that's why he still won't come off the weapons of mass destruction argument. Now, the other argument which worries me about preemption is that now the concept has been extended, not just from states that constitute a threat. It has been extended to groups that constitute a threat within other states. The harbourers argument. That was the basis on which we went to war with Afghanistan, so to speak, to preempt another attack by al-Qaeda. That was indeed the argument used in the case of Iraq. Now, it's certainly the case that the new sort of threat to which nations like ours feel ourselves vulnerable is peculiarly more horrible than they used to be the case from common or garden terrorists. I think it's the case that London felt it could sustain the occasional bomb from the IRA. France, Italy, Spain could sustain the occasional terrorist outrage without feeling that in some sense their way of life was going to be undermined by these sorts of attacks. The suicide car bomber is in a different league from that, as obviously was 9/11. And to that extent, I think countries do feel that they need to take preemptive action, or they feel justified in taking preemptive action against the harbourers of these sorts of groups in a different way from the way they did in the past. But even so, it has to be, I believe, a state that constitutes this threat, not merely a group within a state. We would not have been justified in bombing Dublin because of the IRA bombs in London, because there was no doubt at all the Irish were harbouring terrorists. I don't think myself the Americans would have been justified in bombing Saudi Arabia after 9/11, because undoubtedly many of the terrorists were Saudis. I don't think that we would have been justified in bombing Buenos Aires after or before the Falklands War as a way of preempting an assault on the Falklands. I just don't. We could have been justified in doing many things, but not that. Some doctrine of proportionality, some doctrine of specificity has to apply to preemptive action if preemptive action is to take place. Otherwise, you have got licensed anarchy. You can go and attack any city, any country around the world because it's national is threatening to attack you. There is a good reason for the restrictions that apply to preemptive action, and they are that otherwise we have chaos, bullying, and anarchy. Interventionism, in my view, takes many forms. The old days when the doctrine of sovereignty of states was enshrined in the UN Charter, they've gone. I rather believe in them, but they've definitely gone. We assault nations with economic sanctions, a peculiarly cruel form of aggression. We arrest their citizens. We imprison them without trial. We do all kinds of things to foreign states now and feel we're justified to do so on grounds of preemption. But war, I believe, is different. Going to war is a state act against another state. It is main force. It is subject to mission creep. It is subject to escalation. It is subject, particularly when Britain and America are involved, to the horror of the bombing of civilian cities. It kills people. It therefore kills innocent people. It is counterproductive to that extent. It makes people hate us. It is vulnerable to the charge, highly valid, I think, today, of counterproductivity. It is a stupid form of war, and to that extent, a stupid form of preemption. Above all, it just doesn't work. Nothing has been more preemptive than Putin's activities in Chechnya. It doesn't work. I personally believe it's not working in Iraq. I don't think it works in Afghanistan. I think it's very rare for the terrorism of the bomber to work. On the whole, I'm against it for good, pragmatic reasons. Preemption, in other words, is open to abuse, it's open to distortion, it's liable to become the dictator's charter, and I hope you pass this motion. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Simon. Well, the second speaker against the motion is David Aaronovitch, who is a former student leader. He was indeed president of the National Union of Students. He's been television producer and executive, and he's now broadcaster and columnist for The Guardian and The Observer, where his robust line on the war in Iraq set him aside from many of his colleagues. David.
Thanks, Francine. I'm always grateful to be reminded of the days when I had some degree of eminence in my own right. And actually, funnily enough, since we've spoken about it a lot, just to share with you that this was the period at which I first became interested in Iraq. Many people on the left forget that one of the major acts of the Saddam regime was to actively and completely attempt to destroy, both in its own country and abroad, any vestige of opposition, including that by Iraqi socialists and communists. And it was because of interaction with them that I first became interested in the question of Iraq and realized what a monster we, as the British government was then, were prepared to tolerate and support. And I would submit to you that actually that toleration, that support, that live and let live of Saddam over the years has cost very many more lives in the long run than our invasion of Iraq will cost in the long run. In fact, it's very difficult to see how it could be otherwise. But I'm not going to talk about Iraq very much, because this is about whether or not a preemptive foreign policy is a recipe for disaster. And the suggestion I'm going to make to you is that a largely or purely reactive foreign policy is certainly a recipe for disaster. In fact, we don't even have to speculate about it. We've had a reactive foreign policy, we've had reactive foreign policies for many years, and it has been responsible for many of the disasters that we've seen in the last 20 or 30 years. But first, a kind of note about psychology. There's a study just been published by an academic at Columbia University and an academic at Edinburgh University about how people reacted on and react in times of disaster. Most people believe that if you go to the scene of a large fire, you will find most of the corpses piled up by the escape doors. This appears to be rational behaviour. But actually, that's not true. If, for instance, you have a substantial fire in, say, a superstore, what you will find is that most of the bodies are to be found by the checkout counter. And the reason for this is that people like to try and pay before they escape the conflagration. This is not a joke, this is just an observation about how human beings are. When these people talked to survivors of 9/11, one particular woman that they questioned, who'd been high up in the second tower, watched the first tower be hit by an aeroplane. People went to the window, the most dangerous conceivable place, to see what was happening. And she said that her immediate reaction was, I'm going to get out of here. Now, most of us like to think that that would be our first reaction. I'm going to get out of here. When planes start hitting large buildings right next to the one I'm in, it makes sense to try and get out. But actually, large numbers of people didn't do any such thing. She saw colleagues of hers pick up the telephone and begin to telephone other people about what they were seeing, or indeed, in a couple of cases, about business matters to do with work. One colleague of hers came down many floors with her on the lift and then said, oh, I've left some pictures of my children up on the computer. I'm going to go back to get them. And that woman died. So what happens in these circumstances is that people yearn for the normal, for something they understand, for the quotidian, the everyday, for the sort of law-abiding parts of their lives. And as a consequence, large numbers of them die unnecessarily. And listening to Simon talk, I was reminded of that, because I think that Simon, in his very eloquent way, represents almost as nobody else can the woman who gets back in the lift and goes back to the top of the building. The test of a preemptive foreign policy is not Iraq, but as Chris suggested, is actually Afghanistan. Because the test of whether or not you want a preemptive foreign policy and a preemptive military element is whether you now believe that there should have been military action on the basis of what we thought we knew about Al-Qaeda or could have known about Al-Qaeda at the time, but didn't take. That's the test of it. If you believe there should have been, then in that case you must vote against this motion. If you believe that even then there shouldn't have been, then in that, and that somehow it was better only to take action afterwards, then in that case you may very well vote for this motion with a clear conscience. Can I just remind you of the investigation into the 9/11 disaster carried out by the 9/11 Commission, which reported recently. And it concludes, despite the intelligence community's growing recognition that Afghanistan was churning out thousands of radicals, the joint inquiry found that little effort was made to use the full force of the US military before September the 11th, with the exception of August 1998 cruise missile strikes. Now, if you remember, those were the ones that were commonly supposed to be Bill Clinton's diversion from the affairs of Monica Lewinsky. Former National Security Advisor, this section goes on, Sandy Berger, testified that there was little public or congressional support for an invasion of Afghanistan before September the 11th. In other words, had they at that point gone to the American public and said, look, folks, this is a huge threat, what this guy is doing, and we can expect it to impact upon us, let's go in, what they're saying is they think that people would have turned round and politicians would have turned round and said, don't do it. And Simon's answer, very honourably, is still, you shouldn't do it, you shouldn't have done it. I don't think that it's an answer, actually, that many people here will want to associate themselves with. Maybe they will, but I don't think they will. It makes it all the more surprising that Simon should have mentioned that enormous act of preemption in 1981, launched by Menachem Begin's government on Iraq, which was the destruction of the Osirak reactor. Since he doesn't want the invasion of Afghanistan, let's remind ourselves of the context of the 1981 attack. Both the Israeli Labour government of 74-77 and the Likud government of 1977-81 debated what to do about the Osirak reactor, which was being constructed with French and Italian help. Labour favoured continued diplomatic efforts with the French to head off Iraqi nuclear capability. Likud decided that was too dangerous. The idea of Iraq or any Arab state holding nuclear weapons over Israel was intolerable. The reason for that being fairly obvious, that all these states declared openly that the destruction of the state of Israel was one of their national objectives. While estimates of the time left before Iraq would actually have nuclear weapons ranged from 2 years to 10 years, from 2 to 10, Begin felt it was too risky to wait because the estimates might be wrong and political developments might make it impossible to strike later. The decision to go ahead was taken. The mission was carried out by 9 IAF jets. Now, you have to recall that this is a piece of preemption based on what might happen in 2 to 10 years that Simon supports, but not a piece of action to prevent, let's say, a terrorist attack of whatever magnitude we don't know. And here is the second part of the psychology. What we discovered on September the 11th, for those of us who hadn't understood it, and Senator Gary Hart had understood it, I certainly hadn't, was that there was such a large and plastic group of people who were prepared to blow themselves up and non-combatants in as great numbers as they could organise to kill. This was simply a new thing to me. It wasn't what the Cold War was about, which was about containment of a essentially risk-averse enemy on the part of the Americans and about maintaining its position in the world on the part of the Soviet Union. This was something entirely new. One act of preemption we could have had, I suppose, was to take your mobile phones off you. But never mind, I think we can. That was turned off extremely quickly and therefore means that we don't have to take retaliatory action.
We know where they live. We know where you live.
So, we were faced, and we are faced, with the fact not just in terms of weapons of mass destruction and terrorism, but also in terms of genocides that lead to massive population shifts and to huge problems and to, as Christopher said, to enormous moral problems for ourselves, whether or not we tolerate these things. I'm again referring to Simon's view about the situation in Darfur. It's a very honourable position, but it amounts to this: leave it alone, whatever you do will be worse. It amounts to having to sit there on the sidelines and see hundreds of thousands of people, if necessary, killed because, says Simon, you will probably do worse things in return and you will make people hate you. It is an honourable view, and in supporting this motion, you have to decide to associate yourself with it. That is actually what you want to say. Now we do come to the question of Iraq. And the other test of this motion is this: if it were true, if it were turned out to be correct, that Iraq had the weapons of mass destruction that people thought it did. Remember, it's already failed all these UN resolutions. But if it had turned out, if we had discovered these things lying around the desert and so on, do you therefore then believe that it would have been justified to have invaded Iraq? Because if you do, then you have to vote against this motion. You have to. The discovery that there haven't been weapons of mass destruction, you may put down, if you like, to lying politicians, I think wrongly, or to poor intelligence, I think rightly. But the one thing that you can't do is, if your answer is yes, is vote for this motion. Because actually, you are in favour of a preemptive foreign policy. It's just that you want it to be cleverer. The other thing that you might want to do is you might want to have it by somebody else, and we'll come to that in a moment. The second point about invading Iraq was pour encourager les autres. Iraq was partly invaded because it could be invaded, to send a message to people who couldn't so easily be invaded. North Korea being a classic example, Iran being another example. Libya didn't have to take the message twice. As a consequence, partly, it decided to disarm. This is a major strike in the favour, conceivably in the favour of intervention. In North Korea, we don't yet know. In Iran, it looks as if it's going the other way. It looks as if the policy in that respect has not yet succeeded. Although, to imagine that the Iranians wouldn't be pushing ahead with their nuclear capacity had Iraq not been invaded, I think, is incredibly optimistic. So that was the second reason. And the third reason is the one that Christopher gave, which is when you have failed states, imploding states, states that commit the acts that an Iraq does or not, then you can anticipate enormous problems, even if you don't take the morality of it into account. As a consequence of that, the 9/11 Commission, which castigated the Bush government, the Bush administration and the Clinton for a failure of imagination, for its failure to imagine what could happen if it didn't take preemptive, largely preemptive action, said this: the intelligence community, and particularly the FBI and the CIA, should aggressively address the possibility that foreign governments are providing support to or are involved in terrorist activity targeting the United States and US interests. State-sponsored terrorism substantially increases the likelihood of successful and more lethal attacks within the United States. This must not be limited, this must be addressed from a national standpoint and should not be limited in focus by the geographical and factual boundaries of individual cases. Now, if that's true of the United States, it is also true of us. It is also, incidentally, though they may not always realise it yet, true of the French, of the Italians, and of every other country which could conceivably be targeted. You can take the view that the threat is less than the dangers of taking action to deal with it. That is a perfectly respectable calculation for you to come to, and that it is likely to remain less. And that you don't believe that even to a certain extent left to themselves without preemption, these people will be capable of such acts of atrocity in our countries and in other countries that make us rue the day we were born or the day we gave birth to our children. You can take that view. I would prefer that the United Nations, being a preemptive multilateralist rather than a preemptive unilateralist, I would prefer that the United Nations came to a more realistic view of the threats that faces the nation and of the need for intervention. I would prefer there to be a multinational United Nations force with agreement, quick agreement about quick deployment to places where it was needed. In the absence of that, we have, by and large, the United States. That is a great deal better than nothing, but it does mean that we are dependent in a way which I would rather we weren't. And this brings me to my final point. The difference is not really whether or not there should be a preemptive foreign policy or not. You must have a large element of preemption in your foreign policy for the reasons I've just discussed. What is vital is also that that preemption, like any other foreign policy, is intelligent preemption and principled preemption, and that it is not characterized by Abu Ghraib, and that it is not characterized by Guantanamo, and it is not, wherever you can avoid it, characterized by helicopters who think that the best thing that they can do when a Humvee has been attacked is to fire a few rockets an hour later and bullets into a crowd next to it. Now, that may be asking too much. You can say these things are inevitable consequences and so on, but I think the intelligent application of the only right policy must really be the sort of thing that we would want to vote for. I therefore ask you to vote against the motion.
Thank you, David, and again, thank you to all the speakers for and against. We're now coming to the time where the debate gets open to the floor, but before we do that, I'm just going to announce the vote, the result of the pre-vote, and for the motion, 314, against the motion, 195, and a fairly substantial 183 didn't know, so we'll compare that obviously with the result later on. So now the next, over the next 40 minutes or so, there will be 3 roving mics here. So if you could start to get hands ready to put them up. There is one fixed microphone up on the balcony, and you will need to queue up to use that. But obviously I want to invite as many people to speak as possible, so as soon as one person has finished speaking, could the next people put up their hands if they'd still like to have something to say. And there's a hand up here, if you could. Thanks. You can obviously make a statement or a question, but whatever you do, please keep it as much to the point as possible. No. So can I have some more while we're waiting?
Sorry.
Next hand up as well. So if you go up to the back as well.
Can I just take the panel back to the Iran point, and in particular bring Senator Hart and Simon Jenkins back to the point about unavoidable and immediate. And I'm just interested in how you would set the parameters for when, let's say, Iran becomes unavoidable and immediate. The weekend press reported that they have stockpiles of yellow cake. I don't know what that is, but it sounds ominous. And centrifuges and all these things. Now, in the next 2 years, I would imagine at some point, either General Sharon or Commander-in-Chief Bush is going to have to take the decision, well, at what point are we at? Where are we in this? And do I launch a preemptive strike or not? Now, can I ask you at any point whether a preemptive strike will be justified against Iranian nuclear capabilities? And if so, how we judge when we get there? Because that's what I'm not sure about on this immediate and unavoidable point.
Okay, we'll keep that question for now. Let's take one from the balcony first of all. I promise we will come back to the answers to that, but let's get a couple of questions in.
Yes, I'm surprised and rather disappointed that the supporters of the motion have made such a weak case for it. The worst that can be said against preemptive foreign policy is that it's open to abuse, as Simon Jenkins said. We might as well give up on everything and go home. Everything's open to abuse. It seems to me that the argument they're really making is that they don't like a preemptive foreign policy of a particular kind when it's perpetrated by the administration or government of a country that they don't like, and that's a very narrow subset of all the possible preemptive foreign policies. It seems to me one can make the case, I wouldn't agree with it, for a sort of German-style foreign policy of sort of semi-pacifist, strictly reactive and in accordance with very strictly interpreted international law, where you agonise a very great deal before you get involved and do so only when it's rather too late, as was seen by the German attitude to the war in Yugoslavia. But that case hasn't been made. I'm wondering if the supporters of the motion might like to go back and make it again a bit more vigorously.
Well, I think it's time for you to come back on that. And then there's a question down here. Sorry, please go ahead. Yeah.
In response to the first question, in the Cold War, the three factors that were considered important in terms of the United States defending itself or NATO against a Soviet threat was the three factors were possession of what today we call weapons of mass destruction, or in those days we called strategic weapons. Second, the capability of delivering them. And third, the intent to do so. Now, all this discussion of preemption is well and good, except for several facts, some of which your question suggested. One is, today, North Korea and Iran, certainly the former, are much greater threats to the United States' security and regional security than Iraq ever was. Second, in the next 5 years, in addition to the nations that have biological and chemical weapons already, there will be 20 additional nations developing a biological warfare capability. Is the United States going to preempt all of those simply because they have those weapons of mass destruction? You must have a capability of delivering them, and of course in the case of both chemical and biological particularly, that capability is not long-range missiles. It can be suitcases and shipping containers. But there also must be an intent, some intent to use them. If we use the moral argument, and by the way, I find the moral argument highly persuasive in Sudan tonight, and indeed in North Korea, where at least as many people have died from starvation as ever died in Iraq. But the moral argument has a lot to do with Americans dying, and we are going to reach tipping point sometime in Iraq, sometime between tonight and 5 years from now, where the American people, as they did in Vietnam, will say enough. My son or daughter is not going. And then the rest of the world may have to, if they strongly believe in these things, make up the difference. The British Army is with us in Iraq, but for all practical purposes, much we talk about coalition forces. This is not a coalition effort. The problem of the capability or the ownership of weapons of mass destruction, particularly biological and chemical, which can be manufactured in basements, is an enormous, complicated international argument. And no one in this room should, or this city or this country, should expect the United States to solve this problem all by itself. And finally, we must keep in mind, and again on the moral argument, that it was 20 years ago when the Reagan administration supported Saddam Hussein and its representative to Iraq to help provide that support, including strategic intelligence, was a man called Donald Rumsfeld.
Okay. Well, I'll take Jane Bonham Carter down here, and then up the balcony, and then there's a hand up at the back there.
Both people... Is that working?
Yeah, sorry.
Both people who were speaking against the motion started off by saying they didn't want to talk about Iraq, which in fact they did, but it wasn't the centre of their argument. Isn't this because Iraq just proves that the motion is correct? A preemptive foreign policy has been a recipe for disaster.
Okay. If you can just hold fire on there, we'll take one point from the balcony.
Hello, this is to David Aaronovitch. When there's a correlation between a corrupt authoritarian regime like Syria that has WMD in the form of VX gas and sarin, and Iran that is 2 months' time considered to have a nuclear reactor, along with the sponsoring of international terrorism and the violation of human rights, is it misguided to preempt the states that sponsor international terrorist groups like Syria that sponsors Hamas, Hezbollah, that has in turn ties with Al-Qaeda, both Syria and Iran, which is a link that the Bush doctrine has made as opposed to previous administrations. Previous administrations did not make that link of states that sponsor terrorism and the terrorist groups themselves. Thus, to protect the national security interests of every Western democracy, should Iran and Syria be next on the hit list?
Okay, so if that wasn't clear for everybody, it's essentially, should Iran and Syria be next on any preemptive list? There's a hand up at the back. You've had that hand up for a long time. And then if we could get a microphone down here next. Yeah.
I'd like you to share an assumption with me for 2 minutes that the preemptive action in Yugoslavia and Kosovo was a good thing. That was in 1999. 5 years later on, the territory of Kosovo has been governed by the international community through the United Nations for those 5 years. In the past 3 years, we have witnessed in Kosovo a calamitous contraction of the territory's economy. Kosovo has become, for the first time in the past 120 years, a net importer of people because the refugees who were in the European Union during the campaign are being sent back by EU member states into Kosovo, and the international community has failed to succeed in any aspect of economic transformation. As a consequence, Kosovo is now a boil waiting to suppurate all over the region of the southern Balkans. This is not speculation on my part, it's based on the fact that in March of this year it happened, and if remedial action by the international community, who govern the territory completely, is not taken very quickly, then that boil will, as I say, suppurate. If you are going to make the case for a preemptive foreign policy, which may or may not be a good thing, then surely you have to join it with something that I haven't really seen addressed here, which is a strategy for after your preemptive action. And so far, in most of the cases that we've seen over the past few years, there has not been a successful strategy. Kosovo is a small territory of 2 million people, the majority of whose inhabitants are fanatically pro-American and pro-European. There we have, to date, failed abysmally. Can we really say yes to a preemptive foreign policy in areas where support for Western values and strategies is much less certain?
Christopher and David, would like to come up.
Neither of us was going to let Lady Bonham Carter get away with that. I'm very glad to have the chance to comment. I was, as I know David was, or I guess he was, slightly joking. We pretended, how can Iraq come up in a debate that's only about preemption? In fact, it's a serious point. The conflict with Saddam Hussein has been going on for a very long time. In my little book, available at fine bookstores everywhere and heaped in this lobby, I refer to a long, short war that began shortly after the end of the Cold War with Saddam's obliteration and annexation of a neighboring Arab Muslim country, but that I maintain did not end until his regime was removed. In that period, recall, three things only. International sanctions, which are a very intense form of warfare, as Simon Jenkins was mentioning, were mandated by the United Nations on the whole territory of Iraq. In other words, it was no longer a sovereign state, until Saddam Hussein came into compliance with several very important resolutions. One governing weapons of mass destruction, one governing his need to give an accounting of the missing from his invasion of Kuwait and from other atrocities, one insisting that he renounce all connections to international terrorist groups. No attempt on his part was made at compliance with any of these, so the sanctions stayed on, and the north and southern sectors of the country were patrolled by British and French and American aircraft initially. By the end of the century, it was entirely British and American aircraft, enforcing the no-fly zones and derived from the UN resolutions, and the Iraqi forces fired at those planes every single day. So the only people who were entitled to claim that Bush was launching a preemptive strategy on them, and I hear this whine and complaint the entire time, were those who hadn't been either knowing or caring anything about Iraq all that intervening time. And I'm afraid they constitute the majority of the anti-war movement, and still do.
Yeah, I'll take on the question about whether or not we should invade everybody else, and about Kosovo. I made the point during the speech that I felt that one of the significant reasons for the decision to get rid of Saddam Hussein was the exemplary reason. And I said where I thought it has succeeded, where the jury was still out, and where we appear to be failing. We're failing partially in Iran, and this is a difficulty because the British government has argued with sections of the American administration very much for a process of negotiations with the Iranian regime, thinking that the reform process in Iran was sufficiently strong to also bolster that effort. And what's happened is that the Iranian theocracy has destroyed its own democratic process. It cast out most of the Democrats who supported the candidates who supported the reform process and didn't allow them to stand. It has a significant, although not complete, form of censorship on the press in the area, and the process of reform seems to have gone into reverse at the same time as the Iranian government has played fast and loose with a number of international bodies, including the European Union and the IAEA. Now, I'm going to put this to you quite simply. If we do not take sufficient action, and I don't mean military action in this instance, for the very reason why it wasn't used a long time ago, and the Iranians do get close to making a bomb, given the action that Simon Jenkins, amongst others, supported on the part of Israel in 1981, and given the public statements and the harbouring of terrorists by Iran, which is beyond contestation, is it seriously imagined that the government of Sharon, or any conceivable government of Israel, is going to permit that to happen? In other words, the threat to peace, whether or not you take action, is very substantial, but it is particularly substantial if you do nothing. It is a real and genuine problem, and diplomatic activity, and if it becomes absolutely essential at the end of the day, a more physical form of preemption might be necessary. It is conceivable, and you wouldn't be able to prove an absolute and immediate threat, although you might firmly believe that war could break out the next day as a result of the belief that Iran could get its own bomb. Life is complex. The belief has been also on the part of the British government that Syria could be gently and gradually cajoled out of its use of and its holding of weapons in support for terrorism. In my opinion, this depends crucially on one thing and one thing alone, and that is the success of the democratization process in Iraq. If somehow or other those millions of Iraqi people who want to see democratic change in their country and who don't support, as people seem to imagine, every act of the resistance, if they can prevail, then I'm pretty sure, well, I'm not pretty sure, but I would say it's a good contention that Syria, under those circumstances, will feel the wind around it and will begin to be more compliant and may even, in the long term itself, undertake a reform process. And the final point about Kosovo, I don't accept your characterization of Kosovo, although I certainly do accept that there are problems. There are huge problems, as I don't accept the absolute disastrous notion about Afghanistan, but accept that we have in many ways failed from where we should have been. You're absolutely right. The corollary of this is nation building, and Gary Hart is absolutely right. The corollary of that is that the rest of the world has to be involved as well and not leave it just to the Americans. But I put the question very simply to you. Do we do it or do we not do it? That's the question.
Thank you. I'll take the next question from here and then up in the balcony. And then if you could have a microphone down here on the right, please. Go ahead.
My name is Stephen Schick. I fail to see why Senator Gary Hart thinks that a Republican constitution is somehow a guarantee of a virtuous foreign policy, and that there's something un-Republican about America invading other countries. As I recall it, the Third Reich was a republic, the Soviet Union was a republic. I think the British monarchy has a rather more benign record, in fact. And I would also be interested to know what the proposer's attitude would have been to preemptive action against Hitler before the war. Hitler said in a speech to the Reichstag in January 1939, if international Jewish finance forces the nations of Europe into another war, the result will not be the victory of Bolshevism, but the extermination of the Jewish race in Europe. So we can't say we didn't know.
I'll take the next question from the balcony, and if you could please pass the microphone to that gentleman in the second row in the middle behind you. Thank you.
Madam Chairman, the last speaker referred to the war with Hitler in 1939 when they declared war on Poland, and we therefore declared war on Germany. The danger wasn't immediate, but it was unavoidable, and the whole country was behind that decision. I think perhaps your motion could be a little broader, and if you were to accept an amendment, I would suggest that it says, unless the danger is immediate or unavoidable, not and unavoidable, or unavoidable. Would you accept an amendment?
We can note it.
Thank you.
I seem to remember that we once had an ethical foreign policy. Is it not the case that actually governments always pursue opportunistic foreign policies and that decisions are made on the basis of arguments that take into account a whole lot of other things that we're simply not party to?
Anybody wish to comment on that?
It's interesting, just I prefer that particular question. I have absolutely no doubt that Britain would not have gone to war with Iraq had America not done so. And anyone who says the opposite, anyone who says Britain was so obsessed with the threat posed by Iraq that it would have gone to war pleading with America to come too, it's absurd. We went for a complex of reasons to do with our relationship with America and with Tony Blair's relationship with George Bush, very reluctantly, and we know this well enough. We did not go into this wholeheartedly or willingly or frankly because anyone thought there was a big threat. Look at the absurdity which was visited on MI6, frantically told to scrabble round and find some way of justifying this adventure. It's absurd. It's simply not true.
Well, I wasn't going to comment till Simon said that. That may be true, and he didn't say poodle or anything fatuous, so I congratulate him for this. But it remains the case that in Chicago, at the Council on Foreign Relations, in the year 1999, Prime Minister Blair did make a very important speech following the expulsion of Milosevic's forces from Kosovo and the eventual collapse of his regime, which was the hoped for, if not the intended consequence of that intervention, and said that we're not done. There are still aggressive, totalitarian, destabilizing regimes in the world, including that of Saddam Hussein's Iraq, and there will have to be a reckoning with this. He furthermore very strongly pressed President Bush to intervene in Afghanistan further and earlier and harder and faster than he did. So having previously done that with President Clinton in the matter of Kosovo. So, of course, it happens to be a geopolitical fact the United Kingdom can't do many of these wars on its own, but it is for that reason that some of us do not resent there being an Anglo-American alliance, which it seems to me is at the root of the objection of most people who oppose the war, is they don't like the United States and they don't like Britain being so close to it. So let's have no hypocrisy on this score, please.
I'll take the question there and then one up in the balcony. And could I have a microphone down in the front here, please?
Is this on?
Thank you. Yes, yes, go on.
It's on. Listening to the very eloquent arguments from all four of the speakers, I concluded after the last speaker that I was on both sides of the issue. But the two things that haven't been addressed at all, it seems to me, are the practical issues of consequences and accountability. One obvious consequence of the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan is that it has removed essentially the two enemies of Iran and made Iran, very obviously a much stronger nation than it was when it had to worry about its borders. Another consequence is that if the United States despite having the Supreme Commander with his great military experience and all its arms, after having done pretty much botched jobs in Afghanistan and Iraq, may not have the capability or the will, most substantially the will, to invade Iran or North Korea or Syria, even though it might be more valuable to do so. And there is also the notion of accountability. If something that was very little reported is that after the victory in Iraq and Paul Bremer was set up to administer the country, there was essentially a wholesale fire sale of the industry of Iraq, with the result of hundreds of thousands of people being unemployed, selling to the higher bidder, most of whom didn't bid anymore as a result of the armed resistance. And the question is, can you really debate this whole issue in the abstract without looking at the practical matters, as I've just addressed, but again, consequences and accountability?
Thank you.
The issue here is preemptive foreign policy, but I see that you're discussing it broadly, but the parameters of preemptive foreign policy are not being discussed here. For example, what are the tools that are used to basically use this preemptive foreign policy? Imposition of a regime in Iraq made up of ex-CIA people. So the track record of United States, it's not that the United States does not have good intentions of the world, but the way they have done things in past and are continuing to do in the world are not really exemplary, that they can use this preemptive foreign policy in a fashion that reflects some kind of goodwill for the world. And lastly, Christopher Hitchens wrote a book called Orwell's Victory, in which he said that Orwell was the only person who got the 3 biggest questions of 20th century correct. There was another man who had a great sense of history and a great vision for world foreign policy. His name is Leon Trotsky. He also got it right. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Question down here, and then could I have a microphone in the central aisle down here, please? Thank you.
Is there a case for preemptive foreign policy to protect human rights and on humanitarian grounds, with the potential for regime change that would follow in those circumstances? And could you look, say, at a couple of examples to compare Iraq, as we now know, without any weapons of mass destruction, and Zimbabwe?
Who'd like to take that on? David.
Can I say one thing first about the description of the Iraqi interim government as ex-CIA people? That's just a slander. It's just a straightforward, it's the kind of thing that gets casually and easily said. But for instance, the leader of the Iraqi Communist Party is not a CIA agent. But what is certainly true is that if you were trying to get rid of Saddam before the period when the West suddenly decided that he should be got rid of, then in that case you were likely to have some contact with other people who were interested in getting rid of him. And I think actually one of the things that shows up is the extraordinary tolerance there sometimes is in this country and amongst people who have a significant amount of freedom for the description of people in Iraq who don't support the insurgents, and that is, after all, most of them, and you just described all the Kurds, incidentally, also as CIA people, as somehow deficient or non-existent. These are the people we never talk about in this country, which is the Iraqi majority that does actually support the change and which cannot get its way at the moment because of the actions of insurgents. And despite the incredible mistakes of the Americans, those people are still in the majority. You never, ever hear about them. It is really kind of one of the remarkable silences, or maybe not so remarkable silences, of recent history. That's point one. Point two is the very difficult question about where you go and where you don't go, and it was raised in a way by Senator Hart as well with relation to weapons of mass destruction. How do you decide who you're going to take a tough line with and who not? When is the scale of the activity big enough and when it's not? And we've faced it most recently. We have certainly faced it in Zimbabwe. What was it that we could practically do in Zimbabwe, short of sending white forces in to take out a black government, which would have been incredibly problematic? We've tried sanctions on Mugabe's family, sanctions on Mugabe's immediate people around him. That hasn't worked. We've seen the immiseration of the country get significantly worse. We put our apples in the basket of South Africa, putting pressure upon Zimbabwe, only to find that that's unreliable as well. I'm sorry, I don't actually have a complete answer to you. I think that what's going on inside Zimbabwe is absolutely appalling, but the scale of it is probably such that you couldn't mobilize under any foreseeable circumstances sufficient world opinion to actually intervene and take out Mugabe and replace him with another government. I think the scale of the problem in Sudan is conceivably so big that you could get such an agreement. It seems likely to me that the Sudanese government will actually do just sufficient to convince those people at the United Nations who would rather not see action that action is going to be unnecessary. But I think there's going to have an enormous fight about whether it should happen. But for myself, if you were to ask me what my ideal situation was, there would be a United Nations force which should have been inside Sudan with the United Nations Security Council prompting, not this incredibly kind of slow and resistant business of doing anything, and it should have been there 6 months ago. It should have been there 6 months ago, and we've got to change things so they are.
One sentence. It's only one sentence, but I think I spoke up pretty impressively, if I may say so, for a decisive intervention against the racist rebellion to stop it from seizing power in 1965. It's been all downhill for Rhodesia, Zimbabwe since then. It was because of a failure to act and use force on principle in time. I mean it. The sanctions were never going to work, by the way. Chirac had Mugabe to Paris as an honored guest the same week they were sabotaging the resolution on Iraq at the UN. This is not a principled opposition you're up against. Don't run away with that idea. The objection there is not to unilateralism. It's in favor of promiscuous French colonial unilateralism.
Okay, I'm going to take this question here. Now, could I please have a microphone down also in the central aisle here? The gentleman's had his hand up for quite a long time. Here, down there. So if you would like to go ahead at the back here, first of all. Thanks.
Chairman, it seems to me that preemption is not merely disastrous, but it's logically absolutely nonsensical. If somebody is threatening to me, let me take David Aaronovitch, probably chucking his glass at me. What am I going to do? Preempt him? I come round here and move towards him. He then sees me coming, so he preempts me. And then I see him putting on his boxing gloves, so I put on mine. And so it goes on. I think preemption necessarily implies preemption of preemption, and then preemption of preemption, and so on. It's ridiculous.
I take speaker up in the balcony next, and then down here. And if I could have a microphone over third row from the back, up on the left.
Yes, I was wondering, Mr. Hitchens discussed briefly, and I think that given the solemnities of the issue, it hasn't been discussed enough, the justification for preemptive foreign policy on the basis of genocide, on whether we should have intervened in Rwanda either after or before either after or before the genocide took place, or whether we should be interfering in Darfur now. What I'd like to ask him, and I hate to introduce a note of distinct cynicism into the debate, is whether he really thinks that given the costs, both the economic costs to the Western governments and the potential political cost of body bags, whether that's actually ever going to happen, whether we're ever going to see a situation in which, in the absence of a UN force, the West will intervene to prevent genocide in places very, very far away from home. And if that is not going to be the case, is it really fair to use this as a justification for preemptive foreign policy that so far seems to be mainly used in far more conventional matters of geopolitics?
Thank you. I'm going to ask Christopher to hold his response until his summing up remarks, because I'm very conscious we are running out of time, and I would like to take speaker here, and I would like to take third row from the back over there, if you could get the microphone to him then. Go ahead.
I wanted to thank Mr. Hart for the government of America. I'm an Iraqi, and contrary to most of the people who were talking against Britain and America, 90% of the Iraqis do not support what is happening. They are my people, I speak their language, I meet with them on a daily basis, and believe me, Muqtada Sadr is a thug, they know he is a thug, and the reason he has been able to do what he is able to do today is because he knows that he will not be exterminated by the Americans. Because under Saddam Hussein, the same thug was exactly like a cockroach. He behaved extremely well. And the other thing is preemptive attack has got to be done because we're in the 21st century. We are not fighting the wars of the 20th century. In the 21st century, they are going to blow us up with chemical, biological, and other types of weapons. And unless we do it ahead of them, we are going to suffer.
Thank you. I'm afraid this is going to have to be our last speaker up here because we have to be very conscious of the time and we have to take the final remarks and the final vote. Please go ahead.
I'll try to be quick, but I don't promise. I hope not to tread over any old ground or walk outside of the boundaries of the discussion, but when we say a preemptive foreign policy is a recipe for disaster, who's the disaster for? Is it for George Bush's campaign? Because I doubt that very much. It's definitely not a disaster for the arms trade. But is it a disaster for the Iraqis who happen to go to weddings, who happen to walk down the street and run into or who get arrested in Abu Dhabi? Is it a disaster for the United Nations and international law? And if it is a disaster for an international law, then preemptive foreign policy is not worth voting for. But then moving on, if we need to look at the motion again, we need to ask, is a preemptive foreign policy really a recipe for disaster, or is it actually a dangerous cocktail which involves a serious measure of self-interest? Preemptive strikes did not happen in Rwanda because Rwandans are not rich in oil. Preemptive strikes did not... Sorry, I did say I'll be quick, but not quick enough. Preemptive strikes did not happen in Afghanistan when they were blowing up 2 Buddhist statues, because Buddhist statues don't mean anything to the West. There we go.
Much indeed. I'm very sorry, but the time, I've been told to keep strictly to time. I'm really sorry that we're going to have to leave it for the contributions from the floor for now. I could have taken many more, and I'm sorry that we can't go on for longer. But I'm now going to invite the panelists to make their summing up remarks just in a couple of minutes each. While they do this, instructions now for the final vote. You will have a piece of paper like this, and tear it in half, obviously, for or against, and put it in the correct bin as it goes around. If you haven't made up your mind still or you want to abstain, just put the ticket in as it is, undivided. But please do vote, and please do remain in your seats until the speeches are finished and the final result is announced. No, so we're going to invite David Aaronovitch in reverse order for his couple of minutes of closing remarks.
Right. Okay, I'm going to do some of this slightly interactively because 2 very pertinent points were raised towards the end. And I have a question to ask the 2 people who put the points. The woman up there and the gentleman over there. Both of you said that you were essentially extraordinarily dubious, if not downright cynical, about the purpose of preemptive strikes, because would we be preemptive in Sudan, and would we have been preemptive, should we be, in Rwanda? So I put the question to you. It's very simple. Should we be preemptive in Sudan? I asked the lady up there. Yes or no? You can shout. Yes. Right. Should we have been preemptive in Rwanda? The gentleman over there. Yes or no? Yeah, we should have been preemptive in Rwanda. Thank you very much. Therefore, vote against the motion.
That's what interactivity should be like.
Okay, well, Simon Jenkins.
I'd just like to make 2 points. One relates to this question of which is always used as a debating point in these debates. If you did it in Iraq, why not do it somewhere else? Now, it is, in a sense, a cheap and easy argument to use against the other side, but there is an important point here. The purpose of intervening in somebody else's country, not mine, somebody else's country, has to be for a reason. And the reason is usually expressed in what might be called moral or ethical terms. I don't like that country or its leader. He's not doing something I like. I disapprove of his system of government, whatever. But there has to be a universalizable, to take Kant, a universalizable principle on which you do this. You can't say, I'm going to do it here but not there. Apart from anything else, the principle of deterrence does not operate. What kind of message are we giving to African dictators by not intervening in Zimbabwe? What message are we giving to Sudan by not intervening in Rwanda? You have got to have some principle that is universally applicable. You can't just say, I'm going to do it here because I can do it and I can persuade the Americans to do it or whatever. There is no doubt at all that these arguments today would have been used to intervene in South Africa. It would have been a preemptive intervention against the apartheid regime. It would, I believe, have been disastrous. Leaving South Africa to sort out its own fate has, in the end, proved successful. It would certainly be used, and was indeed used by some, to justify a nuclear attack against Russia. I do not think that a nuclear attack against Russia to preempt some putative Soviet threat to the world would have been a very good idea. It would certainly have killed a very large number of people. The argument that you can be, in a sense, blanket about this is simply stupid. It is stupid foreign affairs, like constantly citing Hitler whenever anybody mentions Iraq. Now, the other point I'd make is this. I do believe that there is a case for targeted preemption of one sort or another. I think there was a case for sending that missile against the al-Qaeda base by Bill Clinton. I think there would have been a case for doing something very similar. I do not think, with Chris Hitchens, that it was a good idea to intervene to save cultural monuments. I don't like the idea of the American Marines landing to save the Newbury bypass. On the whole, there are things I don't like in the world, but they're not things I'm going to send the US Marines in to stop. We've got to try and get some concept of proportionality here. Now, there's no doubt at all that sending troops to war is a seriously drastic thing. There's nothing more terrifying at the moment. I used to think the worst thing was right-wing imperialism. There's nothing more terrifying than left-wing imperialism. The idea that we can go around the world picking off people we just don't happen to like and then summoning up the American Marines to go to war is absurd. It's become almost the common parlance of the pro-war lobby now. And the idea that there is something which David wants, which is called clean military intervention, is equally absurd. Anyone who's been to Iraq knows that that is a ghastly shambles. We can sanitize it by appealing to some silent majority of Iraqis, but the fact is it's a terrible mess, and all our interventions are terrible messes. You do not go into other people's countries, blast them to pieces, and then find you've got some clean result which establishes a nice democratic and acceptable regime in its place. This concept of going to war should be taken far more seriously than it's being taken at the moment. It is the last resort, it should be regarded as the last resort, and at the moment it's being used as a first resort with disastrous results.
I can't be erect, I can at least stand up. On the question of Leon Trotsky, I don't get asked this enough. I'm not going to do it tonight. You can see me afterwards. But thank you for asking. I wish people asked more often. Elementary clean-up. Neither David nor I mentioned the name Hitler in connection with Iraq. I don't think in any of our writings we've done it either. It's not necessary. It's an exaggeration. Those who say that they hear us doing it all the time must be suffering from some uneasy conscience on the point, I sometimes think, about intervention. Why is John Kerry going to lose, in my judgment, in November? No, not that any of you asked me. I'm replying to the question I was waiting for. It has its bearing, however. He was asked how he would have done things differently, and he said, as president, he would really beef up the police and firefighting and emergency services. There are two problems with this. They are a state responsibility. The president doesn't do police firefighting. It's not a federal job. And the second thing is, police and emergency crews move in to clean the corpses out of the rubble after the attack has taken place. Nothing needed to be said. Not many people even know Kerry said it, but the impression given is an impression I'd quite like to leave you with. That's what happens when people can't even think preemptively. Now, to the genocide question that was very serious, I have to condense myself very much. At the time of the massacre of the Armenians, there was no such word as genocide. Ambassador Morgenthau, the American ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, referred in his cables very eloquently to race murder when he was addressing President Wilson and trying to involve Americans in doing something about it. Nothing got done. The word genocide didn't exist while the final solution was actually underway in the occupied territories of Nazi imperialism either. Professor Lemkin in Geneva was working on a term that would cover it at about that point. And furthermore, both those two genocides took place under the cover and under the color of an already larger and wider war, which not enough had been done, in my judgment, to preempt in either case. So it has to be said, probably those two populations, once the hostilities had begun, and once those parties had seized power, were very, very nearly beyond saving. Doesn't mean we should have done nothing, but it sure means that we didn't do anything. Didn't even bomb the railroad lines to Auschwitz. That's a shame we have to live with. Don't make the best the enemy of the good. Don't make the worst the enemy of the good either. Just because we can't do everything doesn't mean we mustn't try something. It doesn't mean we don't recognize the symptoms, among other things. It doesn't mean we don't know we've been warned, which is what I meant by Bamiyan. I wasn't making a frivolous point about cultural treasure. I was saying they were warning us. We should have said we got the point and be willing to act upon it. And as for the people of Kosovo and Bosnia, who don't have any oil either, by the way, in response to, I thought, a very nasty and cynical suggestion from the gentleman over there, we intervened in Bosnia and Kosovo far too little and far too late. But the evidence of the chaos and the disruption, the fiasco, all the other words that Simon used so gloomily in these cases, is evidence just as much for the failure of intervention, for the postponement of it, for the willingness, the denial, if you like, the sense of denial that puts off the reckoning, that tries to turn away from responsibility, and which ends up with the saddest words that are still in any tongue, in any language, which are too little and too late. I think we could at least begin by saying we had sworn off that definitively. Thank you.
And finally, summing up for the motion, Gary Hart.
Well, first of all, to say that John Kerry can neither think preemptively or is willing to ranks in preposterousness with George Bush saying the only alternative to invading Iraq is doing nothing. What I want is a president of the United States, what I want is a president of the United States who will tell the American people the truth. If the purpose of invading Iraq was to remake the politics of the Middle East, then say so. I don't want a president who fires his economic advisor for saying accurately this war will cost $200 billion. I don't want him to retire the chief of the Army for accurately saying we need to send 200,000 American forces. And there's a lot of talk here tonight about we should do this and we should do that. There's no finer fighting man in the world than a fine British soldier. If you're going to talk this way about we must do this and we must do that, then you're going to institute the draft, raise taxes in Great Britain, and get an army bigger than one that fits in Wembley Stadium. The United States is not going to do this job alone. So we can pontificate about we must do this, and the moral argument is that, but American casualties in Iraq are now 12,000. And we are going to lose thousands of more Americans, not just dead, but without arms, without legs, with mental problems, and we'll have to deal with that for the next 20 or 30 years as we have with Vietnam. So when the President of the United States talks about war on terrorism, what's he talking about? Does that mean we quiet down our criticism of the Russians for the way they've treated the Chechens, or does it mean we send the 82nd Airborne Division to support the Russian army to crush the Chechens? What is this talk about war on terrorism and we must do that and we must do this? We're either in this together, folks, and we're all going to pay a price. This isn't just the United States job. The fourth power that's talked about in this book is the constitutional principles of the United States. In the Cold War, we had a policy that the enemy of our enemy was our friend. We have made some very strange friendships in this war in Iraq. number of brutal dictators are on our side simply because we've paid them money or provided them weapons. So my country is not going to crush terrorism or deal with, become the avenging angel of the world or do away with evil until we understand that we stand on principle and we must behave according to those principles.
Oh, okay. Right, I will remind you that before the debate, 314 voted for the motion, 195 voted against, and 183 didn't know. Now I'm going to, because they want a moment or two to put the results up, I'm just going to remind you that on your way out, books by the speakers will be available in the foyer. And Gary Hart will be signing copies of his book, The Fourth Power, on this stage here straight after the debate. And I can now reveal that after the debate, the vote is 265 for and 400 against. And a mere 45 were still undecided. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your contributions. Thank you to the panel.